leads to, we're starting a new series this week. We're calling it Elect Exiles. Elect Exiles. And we're going through the book of, or parts of the book of 1 Peter. So I invite you to turn there, if you have your Bibles with you, to the book of 1 Peter. If you didn't bring a Bible this morning, there's one in the pew ahead of you. And as soon as I get back to the podium, I'll tell you what page. Page 857 in the brown pew Bible. So you just turn there, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this series, Elect Exiles. Now, on the surface, it seems like a bit of a strange title, because what does it mean to be an exile? It's an actual question. Nobody knows? To be cast out, to be a cast off, to not have a home, to not have a place. How about this word elect? We were just talking about the election. That's a bit of a different use of that word, but the same general idea. It means to be chosen, to have a home, to have a place. They're kind of opposites. So what do we mean when we talk about being elect exiles? Well, let's just look at the very first words that Peter writes. This isn't what the part of the letter we're going to be talking about most today, but I just want you to look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 1. It says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, to those that God has chosen, who are strangers in the world, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So there's people who have been probably living in Jerusalem, have been scattered throughout the Roman Empire, and they no longer have a home, a place to call their own. Verse 2, who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and by the sprinkling by His blood. So what does it mean to be elect exiles? What are we talking about? Well, Peter is writing this letter to Christians who have fled from Jerusalem, and they're throughout the Roman Empire. They don't have a home anymore, and they fled because of persecution of their faith. But as they fled, they brought the gospel with them. They continued to live according to their calling. They continued to, as we say, demonstrate and declare the transforming power of the gospel. So to be an elect exile means that we are sent away. We're not in our home. We're not in our place, but we're there for a purpose. Okay, we are called to be exiles. We're called to be unchosen and on the side. And the most of the Bible is written from that kind of context. Now, for most of Western history, Christianity has been in the center of culture. It's had cultural power and cachet, and that's changing. And I think that's kind of for the good of both the church, and us. But it does mean that our situation is different than most of what we look back on Western history, and it's going to increase to be like that. But it is not different than most of the Bible. And so we're going to spend some time, the next 5 weeks, but it's going to take us 6 weeks to do it. But that's another story. I won't get into that. Anyway, we're going to spend 5 weeks talking about, well, then what? If we are elect exiles, if we are called to be in this place on the side of culture, on the fringes of culture, if this isn't our home, how do we live? How is Peter encouraging the people that he's writing to live? How is he encouraging us to live? If this is, at least in some sense, our position, how do we live? So this morning we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 to 19. So again, page 857 in the brown pew Bibles over there. Just stand up if you're there, and I'll read it out to us. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 to 17. And remember, we're asking the question, if we are elect exiles, if we're called, but yet at the same time we are not in our home, how do we live? Verse 13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given to you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires that you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all that you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your life as strangers here in reverent fear. For you know that it is not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you have been redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So what's this first? How do we answer that question? How then shall we live? Here's how Peter answers it first. The first thing we're going to look at, that he says, live in holy conduct. So we're going to talk about holiness this morning. Well, that's a bit of a difficult topic, and this is what happens when I let someone else do the preaching schedules. I get the difficult topics because holiness is something that I don't think that we understand very well. In fact, we misunderstand it. At best, holiness, we look at holiness and we think that that's somebody doing right things, just doing the right things. And at worst, it takes on like a negative aspect. We talk about people being holier than thou or being goody two-shoes, right? And it's like almost a character defect to be holy. And we look and it's a negative. But that's not at all what holiness is in the Bible. So I think before we even talk about how to be holy or what it looks like, we need to talk about what holiness is at all. What does it mean to be holy? What is holiness? Well, Peter roots his concept of holiness in the Old Testament. Did you see in verse 15? Verse 15 and 16, he says, "But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For," anytime you see for, that's the reason. "For it is written, be holy because I am holy." Now, if you notice that's in quotation marks, Peter is quoting, and he's quoting God in Leviticus, who over and over again says, "Be holy as I am holy." And that word holy in the Hebrew that Leviticus was written in is kodesh, which means to cut off. And there's this idea of separation. And what God is communicating in Leviticus is, I am separating you, I am setting you apart for a purpose. That's what holiness means. It means to be set apart for a purpose. So a little illustration. My wife has a severe nut allergy, and so we don't go out to eat very often. We basically never, ever get desserts because desserts tend to either contain nuts or they're made outside from a different place in the different restaurant, and they're brought in and they contain nut products. But occasionally we'll call ahead to the restaurant and say, "Hey, we'll explain the situation." And what they'll do is they'll take a station in the kitchen, right? And they'll clean it up. They'll sanitize it. They'll clean everything up, and then nothing is allowed in that area. There's nothing, no nut products, no utensils that have been used with anything else, just in case there's cross-contamination. This area of the kitchen is set apart. But they don't just leave it there and do nothing with it the whole evening. No, they've set it apart for a purpose, so that they can then prepare food in it that is free of any contamination of nuts. It's been set apart for a purpose. And that's what God is saying. That's what that word holy means when God's using it in Leviticus. So he set apart for a purpose. That begs the question, well then, what purpose are we set apart from, right? And in order to understand that, we need to understand the whole purpose of Leviticus. So what's going on in Leviticus? Many of you would say not much. But what's happening is, if you know that the narrative of the Bible is in Exodus, the second book of the Bible, God is rescuing his people Israel out of slavery in Egypt. He's redeeming them. And he brought them to Mount Sinai where they worship him, and he comes down to them and he says, "You will be my people and I will be your God." He adopts them. He makes them his own. And then he gives them his law, which is what the whole book of Leviticus is about. He gives them this law. But often we look at the law and we say, the law is how Israel became God's people. It made them into God's people. They followed the law and they became God's people. No. They were God's people when he rescued them out of Egypt, and he said, "I will be your God and you will be my people." They were God's people there at the base of Mount Sinai before the law. So the law didn't make Israel God's people. The law was given to Israel because they were God's people. So he made them his people first, and because they were his people, he gave them the law. Why? Because of the purpose that he brought Israel out of Egypt for. You see, when he said, "You will be my people and I will be your God," he also said, "You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Okay, we get that holy nation part, set apart, a nation that's set apart for a purpose. What does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? What is a priest? A priest is someone who mediates between God and man. So they show man, they show the world what God is like, and they make a restitution for people before God. So they're an intermediary. But you don't need a whole nation of priests. You just need one. Okay, it's like until last night, the problem with the Edmonton Oilers. They had all playmakers and no shooters. Nobody cares about the Oilers, so just me. So it doesn't make any sense to anyone else, but it was just frustrating me, so it had to come out. But you don't need a whole nation of priests. You just need a handful of priests for the nation. Except God didn't say, I'm going to make you a nation with priests. He said, I'm going to make you a kingdom of priests. Why? Because Israel's job was to be priests for the whole world. See, when he called them to be his own people, he didn't just have in mind them, he had in mind the whole world. And he said, you, as a nation, as a kingdom, I'm going to be the king, and you're going to show the world what I'm like. You're going to show the world what I'm like. And so when he gives instructions to build the tabernacle, which was kind of his tent among his people, he said, the whole world will come and worship me here and get to know me here because you are my priests, and you will demonstrate and declare what I am like. And when the temple or the tabernacle had a permanent home and became the temple, an actual building in Jerusalem, and Solomon dedicated, he said, the whole nations will come and they will worship in these courts. Because Israel's job, their purpose, was to demonstrate and declare what God is like. There would be a nation of priests. So they were given these laws to be pure, to be set apart, to be different, to be holy, because they had a job to do, to show the world what God is like. So God was making Israel the priests of the whole world. And that's what the law is about. It's about showing Israel how to point to God, to show the world what God is like. And that's why they had to be set apart. See, God's law wasn't given to make them God's people. God's law was given because they already were God's people. And they were to be a centripetal force. Right, physics people? Centripetal force, a drawing into the center force. And the world was to come to God through Israel because of the work that they were doing. Now, in many ways, Israel failed in that role, didn't they? But it was through that nation that God sent Jesus. The perfect demonstration, the perfect declaration of who God was in the person and the work of Jesus. And through Jesus, God reconciled the whole world to himself through his death, his burial, and his resurrection. That God reconciled the world to himself. So this commission, this purpose that God gives Israel, Peter confirms on the church as well. We don't have any time to look at it, but if you flip the page, no, same page. Oh, where is it? I need to look at my notes. 2:9, that's where it is. Just on the top of the page, sorry. Next page, Peter says, the reason is the text font here is different than in my Bible that I was reading. Same words. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. Same thing, different word, same concept that God declared to Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, and now Peter is saying this belongs to the church as well. You have the same purpose as God's people did in the Old Testament. So this is our purpose. We're called to live holy. We're called to live holy, and we're called to live holy because we're called to demonstrate what God is like. We're called to demonstrate what God is like. Israel was supposed to be a centripetal force, drawing the people to themselves and to God. But the church, and this is really demonstrated in Peter here, the church is called to be a centrifugal force, where the force thrusts us out. Okay, like a planet that comes, or a comet that comes around the sun, and it's thrust out to the outer rims of the galaxy. I don't know. I shouldn't talk physics. I don't know what I'm talking about. Something like that. But because of our interaction with God and how he changes us and his power in our lives, we're flung out into the world. And that's what happened in Peter. They were cast out. They were exiles throughout the world because of their calling and because of their purpose. Okay, so as we go out, we're called to proclaim the goodness of God and the transforming power of his good news, which hopefully sounds a lot like what we say our purpose statement is here at the church. So that's what holiness is. It means to be set apart for a purpose. But it means more than that too. To be holy means to be whole. In the English language, the word holiness belongs with the same word group as wholeness. Okay, and that leads to lots of puns that I won't subject you to right now. But this idea that holiness is related to wholeness comes from this idea of to be holy means to be consistent, where everything in your life lines up. It's all part of the same whole. So when we first moved to UBC, they installed a roundabout near our house. And generally, I think roundabouts are a bad idea. Sorry, Michael, I know it's as English as the Queen, but generally, I think roundabouts are a bad idea. But this one was even worse because the arrows on the pavement differed from the arrows on the sign. It didn't make any sense. You didn't know what lane to go in. Now, I wasn't smart enough to take a picture of it, but I found another image, and I think this is English too. They're just so good at roadway design. And you see, this isn't holy because it makes no sense. The sign says one thing and the lines say another. What are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to behave? It's a conflicting sign. And if our purpose is to be a sign pointing to God and who He is and what He's like, we can't be like this. And oftentimes our lives aren't they? Where we say one thing and we do another, and there's just not wholeness in our life. So holiness means to be whole. It means to be consistent. So that means that wholeness means that our life has to match our belief. So I mentioned earlier we misunderstand what holiness is, and we have this phrase, holier than now. Some of you weren't born in Canada. You might not be familiar with that phrase. It basically means, oh, this guy over here thinks he's so good, and he looks down on me because he thinks he's better than me. That's the attitude that the religious leaders had about Jesus. They were so holy, and they didn't think he was, that they were motivated to kill him. Which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, I'm more godly than you, so I'm going to murder you. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet, that's what happens to us because when we perceive that we have this moral uprightness, then we look down on others if we think that we have earned it ourselves. And that's not holiness. We might think it is, but it's not. It's not whole. It's not all together. It doesn't line up with each other. And just recently, this was brought home to me very, very strongly. A friend of mine posted on Facebook a news story, just a recent news story. Maybe you've heard it, coming out of New York. And there's this church. I'll use quotation marks, hopefully. There was the church leaders were trying to get these two teenage boys to repent, a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old, and they beat them, and they kept beating them, and they never repented. And the 19-year-old is the 17-year-old is severely injured, and then the 19-year-old stopped beating and he died. Because this group of church leaders were so holy that they wanted to make sure that these guys repented, and they killed him. And this friend that shared it, he's a victim of church abuse too. His mom was a leader in the church, and one night got upset at him and sat on him and punched him in the face until he passed out, and she was just recently acquitted of this. And so this action of these people is completely destroying my friend's view of God. So why do I share these stories? Two reasons. The first is that we can't fake holiness. We can't fake it. It isn't just religious observance where we put it on and we put it on and there's no change in the core of who we are, because eventually it breaks out. And often, not always, but often it breaks out in this anger and into this lashing out at people. It often turns us into proud people because we feel that we have worked up this holiness, this righteousness. But it's not true, because it doesn't define all of who we are, and it breaks out and it comes out. There's no such thing as a partial holiness where I can be holy in this area but not holy in another. Okay? Holiness means wholeness. It means that all of us are made holy. But there's another reason why I share these stories. And it's because when I was reading about this news article and this New York incident, I was reading the comment section. I don't know why. Generally, not a good idea to read the comment section of Yahoo. But I was reading this, and this one guy, his comment caught my eye, and he said, "How you choose to express your belief is more important than what you choose to believe in. How you express your belief is more important than what you choose to believe in." Essentially, I don't care what you believe in. And he went on to say this: I don't care what you believe in, and listed off all these crazy things, as long as you're not violent about it. So your belief doesn't matter. It just better not affect your action, basically, is what he's saying. But here's the thing: you can't divide your your belief and your expression of that belief. If your belief doesn't affect your action, then you don't actually believe it. Right? If your belief doesn't change how you behave, you don't believe that thing at all. The Bible teaches us that we need to be saved, doesn't it? It teaches us that we're more broken, that we're more evil, that we're more messed up than we ever thought. We're more broken, we're more evil, and we're more messed up than we ever thought. But the Bible also teaches us that God went to incredible lengths to bring us back to himself, to save us. Not just to save us, but to adopt us and make us his. So this means that we're more loved, we're more accepted, we're more cared for than we ever dared hope. So we're more evil, more lost, more broken we ever thought, and we're more loved, more accepted, and more cared for than we ever dared hope. So what does this mean for our life? It means that we live humbly. We can't look down on others. We can't possibly be proud because we remember the depths that we were plucked from. And we didn't work ourselves up. We didn't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. But we were brought out of that by God's gracious action. But on the same side, we know that we can put ourselves out there. We can be on the edge. We can take chances. We can make risks because we know that we are cared for and that we are loved and that we are accepted. We don't have to constantly be defending our honor or our reputation or our names because we know that all of that is secure, held secure in Christ. Because if he calls me beloved, it doesn't really matter if no one else does. It does if I'm living in a way that doesn't make me love, but it doesn't if I'm trying to be honest and I'm trying to live as God is calling me to, and people don't like it. That doesn't matter because he has called me beloved. You see, what we believe, if we really believe it and don't just confess it, if we really believe it and we don't just talk about it, it has to change our action. So these people in New York, it wasn't that they believed, too much. It's that they didn't believe enough. They believed or acted like God was completely different than he actually is. Okay, so when we talk about holiness, it's not that we don't believe enough. It's not that we believe too much. It's that we're not believing enough. We're not actually believing and holding to what we say we believed, what we believe. So holiness means that we're whole. It means that our life matches our belief, but it also means that our life matches our purpose. So we believe that the gospel has a transformational power. It has the power to transform us and those around us. And we see our purpose as bringing renewal to our city and to our world by demonstrating and declaring that power, that transforming power. That's great. That's wonderful. I'm so happy we have it on our bulletin and up on our wall. But here's the question. Does our life actually demonstrate that purpose? Do we see the value in these things? Notice that we're not in the core values series anymore, but we kept them up because it wasn't just a series we talked about. It's things that we want to be true of us. So do we actually value that everything is worship? Do we see that in our life, that because of who God is, that everything we do can be directed to him in worship? Do we actually value everyday mission? Do we believe that God is great enough that everybody should worship him, not because he demands it, but because that's what's best for them and for us? And so we're motivated to live in everyday mission. Is that how our lives line up? Does our life line up with our purpose that comes from our beliefs? Do we express a dependence on Christ, or do we think, well, he's given us this job, but he doesn't really care about us, so we just got to go and do it by ourselves? Or do we express a dependence on Christ? Are we equipping each other? Are we acting as ministers? Are we growing because God's glory is so great and amazing that we can never understand it fully, and we want to continue to push deeper and deeper into it? These are things that we say we believe, and they're form our purpose, but are they expressed in our life? So what does it mean to be holy? It means that we're set apart for a purpose, and it means that we're whole, that there's consistency between our belief and our life, and between our purpose and our life. So then that then leads us to the question, how can we be holy? If that's what being holy is, how do we do it? It sounds difficult. Peter gives us 3 ways to be holy, but these aren't how-to. These aren't like Pinterest steps. These are what Peter's doing is he's saying holiness isn't primarily a do. It's not something you do. Holiness is primarily a be. It's something you're made to be. Okay, so what Peter does is he gives us 3 things to look at, and these things are our motivation and they're our method for being holy. They're our motivation because they remind us of what God has done for us, and that motivates us to use our lives to point to him. But they're also our method because it's only by what God has done for us that we can be holy. And so looking at what he's done for us and looking and dwelling on it and making our life consistent with it, that's the only way to be holy. So Peter points to our hope, he points to our Father, to our redemption. Our hope, our Father, and our redemption. And he reminds us of these truths, and he urges us to remember them and to have them play out in our life. So hopefully you still have your scriptures open, and we're going to look at how Peter points us to our hope. So that's in verse 13. Very start. Peter starts off like this. He says, "Therefore prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed." Set your hope fully on the grace to be given to you when Jesus Christ is revealed. So sometimes we use this word hope to mean something that we wish for. I hope that happens. I hope this happens. But that's not how the biblical authors use the word hope. They use the word hope to talk about something that's secured, something that's already there, something that's coming. It's completely guaranteed. So it's kind of like holding a confirmation order from Amazon. Okay, it's something, it's coming, as long as they're not using Canada Post to deliver it, which they don't. That was a cheap slam. I'm sorry, Canada Post. You've always been good to me. I don't know why I'm picking on you. But it's a secure thing. We've ordered it. We've paid for it. It's coming. We know it, and we're holding on. This is my hope. We're holding our Amazon receipt. This is my hope that this book will come. And sure enough, it does, because it's secured. It's already been bought and paid for, and it's delivered, right? But the hope that Peter is talking about is a lot better than some FedEx guy carrying in a book that I was waiting to read, which I'd get on my Kindle anyway, so it doesn't matter. But here specifically, Peter ties our hope to this idea of the grace that we'll receive when Jesus Christ appears. The grace we'll receive when Jesus Christ appears. What's he talking about? Well, Peter is referring to the end of time when Jesus Christ appears. So we talked about this world not being our home, right? That we're exiles in this world, but that's not how the story ends. The book of Revelation is just a few pages later. It was written a little bit after this book, but it's written to similar people that Peter's writing to. It's written to Christians who are scattered throughout the Roman Empire, and they're facing persecution. They're facing great persecution, and it's about to ramp up. It's about to increase. This is the Neronian, that's how you say it, Neronian persecution. That's the Christians made into candles to light the city persecution. That's the lions versus Christians in the Colosseum persecution. This is the great persecution. And John himself, who wrote the book, he's in exile on an island of Patmos, which is like a prison island type thing. So he gets it. He gets that this world is not our home. And what does he write? Sometimes when we sit in our comfy living rooms, we don't understand the book of Revelation. But if you were waiting to go and face a lion in a Colosseum, you would get it. The point of the book of Revelation is, even though it doesn't look like that's going to happen, Jesus wins. Jesus wins. And so these Christians, having read this book and seeing that at the end of history, at the end of the book, Jesus wins, they could go and they could face their martyrdom. They could go and they could continue to proclaim Christ even though they know what it could mean for them. Because despite all of the visual evidence around them that the church loses, they know that in the end, Jesus wins because they've seen the end of the book. And that's what played out in history. Persecution after persecution, local, state, all kinds of persecution, but came across the church and it was never defeated. It only grew. So much so that one Christian thinker in that time said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. That out of the persecution grows the church. Why? Because they read the end of the book and they knew that even though this wasn't their home now, even though it looked like everything was against them, that in the end, Jesus wins. So that even if all they had to do to escape this persecution was to deny Christ, they wouldn't do it. Because they saw the end of the story and they saw that Jesus wins. So that's that hope that Peter is pointing us to. Remember, at the end of the story, Jesus wins. But it isn't just that idea that Jesus wins that Peter is imparting here. It can be very easy, if that's the only thing we think about, it can be very easy to then divide the world into two camps, those who are with Jesus and those who are against him. And we say, oh, we're with Jesus and we're going to win at the end and you're going to lose, and we just do whatever, we hide out, we condemn everybody around us, and that's going to profoundly impact the way that we live. But Peter says more than that. He says, yes, at the end Jesus wins. That's the hope that I want you to remember. But remember more than that. Remember the hope. The hope of what? Set your hope fully on what? On the grace given to you when Jesus Christ is revealed. On the grace. So in this remembering that it's our King that wins, we were reminded that he's only our King because of his grace. That apart from him, we would just be like everybody else around us. And that apart from him, it would be us that he's coming to destroy, to be victorious over us. So we're brought to Christ by his grace, and we're only saved by his grace. So then we view our time here very differently. We don't just hole up waiting for the Calvary to roll in. We demonstrate grace and we point to grace. We don't condemn others, we don't curse them, but we show them the change that God has worked in us. So Peter points us to this hope. And then Peter also points us to our Father. Look at verse 17. Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. So Peter's pointing us to this amazing privilege that we have. You see, God didn't just redeem us through Jesus and leave us. No, through the crucifixion, the resurrection, or crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, we become identified with him. So Jesus took what was coming to us, God's judgment, and he gave to us what was coming to him, God's favor, the ability to call the righteous judge Father. And we become heirs, sons, children of God. The God of the universe, we call him Father. And this is mind-blowingly amazing. In every way that being an exile is a demonstration of powerlessness, being able to call God Father is a demonstration of power, of access, of purpose, of identity, of basically everything that being an exile isn't. And we're able to do that because of Jesus' grace to us. But on the other hand, Peter also reminds us, conduct yourself in fear. I played hockey a lot when I was younger, and my dad, I think, watched every game. Thanks, Dad. But he was also a referee, so especially when I was a little bit younger, he would often watch those games from the ice as a ref, and he'd ref my games. And I wasn't a dirty player. I was a good skater, but I was also very proud. And so anytime someone would knock me off the puck, I'd fall in such a way that I'd end up slashing them or tripping them or getting back at them in some way. Thankfully, I'm not like that anymore at all. I'm perfect now. But then I was rotten. No. But I must have been good at that because no other referee ever gave me a penalty for that. Unless it was my dad. Because he knew. He knew what I was like, and he was watching for it. Right? And so there was seasons where I wouldn't get a single penalty except for the games that my dad was refereeing, and I'd get at least one or two or more. So I understand that if you call Father the one who judges righteously, you got to behave, you got to watch out, you got to be careful, right? Because that's what it was like going to every hockey game when my dad was reffing, that I knew I had to follow the rules and I couldn't pull this stuff because he would catch me. But why? Why couldn't I get away with it when I could get away with it from every other referee, but not my dad? There are two reasons, I think. The first is that, like I said, that my dad knew. He knew my tendency, and he was watching out for it. But the second reason is more important. Second reason I couldn't get away with it is because my dad cared. Every other referee that reffed our hockey games, they only cared about what happened on the ice in between that period of time. And all they cared about was that the game was fair and it was clean, and hopefully nobody got hurt. That was their world. That was all. But my dad, his world extended beyond that because he cared about me. He cared about who I was. And he knew that if I got away with those selfish plays, with those trying to defend my pride, that it would affect my character, that it would change who I was, and it would set in and it would take root in my heart, and it would make me proud and selfish and constantly trying to get back at people. See, to my dad, as a ref, as the judge, in that hockey sense, he didn't just care about the game, he cared about me. So what's the point? When we talk about God as Father, sometimes we think, since he's the judge, he's just there with a big wooden spoon, and if our dads can carry a spoon, how much more can God carry a spoon? A big, really big one, right? And he's just waiting till we screw up to hit us. But that's not what Peter is saying here. Peter is saying, no, God loves you and he accepts you and he's adopted you. You are in him, but because you're called by his name and you now represent him, he cares about you. And yeah, he'll discipline you. But that discipline is a sign of his love. It's not a denial of it. And it's a sign that he's called us on mission, not a denial of it. And we're called to reflect him and to look like him, and he cares about that. So because he desires to see us grow, because he desires to see us be like him, he desires to see us engaging in the purpose that he set before us. So that's what it means to call God the judge, Father. And Peter points us back to that. Remember the honor that this is. Remember how much access you have because you get to call the judge Father, but also remember that there's a responsibility that comes with it. And then finally, Peter points us to our redemption. Both our hope and the fact that we can call God Father stems from this third place that Peter has us look. Look at verse 18 and 19. For you know that it is not with perishable things such as silver and gold that you have been redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. It's telling that Peter's call to holiness gloriously crescendos here. It's telling because it's the main thrust of his call to holiness, and Peter is not in this giving us a call to action, or at least a call to action only. He's calling us to remember. He's calling us to remembrance. And again, holiness is not a do, it's primarily a be because of the work that has already been accomplished on our behalf. No one can separate themselves for a purpose, right? You need someone else to separate you for a purpose. And no one can make God their Father. We need God to make him our Father. And we can't make ourselves whole. A broken thing or a broken person cannot make themselves whole. They need something outside to make themselves whole. So this is all talking about a be. And no one can redeem themselves. But it took Christ to redeem us. It took Christ to redeem us. And I know I'm not telling you new information. And Peter knows that he's not telling us new information. Because look here, he says, for you know. For you know. You already know this. I'm just reminding you. I'm not telling you new information, and I know that. But I'm saying that this is something we need to be continually reminded of because it becomes less and less true in our lives, and we need to remember it. Because sometimes the things that are the greatest and the glorious, we can't deal with them, so we have to dim them just to understand them. And Peter's saying, don't do that. Remember, this is true. Okay, so this is how we live a holy life. We look to Jesus. Gold and silver, as great as they are not enough to purchase us, to redeem us. It took something infinitely more valuable, the blood of Christ. Gold and silver couldn't give us a purpose. They couldn't give us a new hope. It took the precious blood of Jesus. He who knew no sin became sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Infinitely more costly than the purest gold or the finest silver. You see, he was the elect. He was the elect. Jesus was the elect. He was the son. He was the heir. He was the elect, but he became an exile. Why? To make us children. He took what we deserve so we could get what he deserved. A purpose, a wholeness, a future, a father, everything that we've talked about. He is our Redeemer, and there's no other way that we can be holy but to look to him who made us holy by his blood. We need to tattoo this on our eyelids, metaphorically, not literally. Please don't do that. But how much different would our lives be and our actions be if before we did anything, before we said anything, before we responded to anybody, we remembered that the heir, the king of the universe, became an exile for me so that I might become a child of the King of God. You see, truth matters. Belief matters. And if we truly believe this, the simplest, the most basic, the most foundational truth of Christianity, if we truly believe it, it completely changes our lives. So then, what does this look like? What does it look like to be holy? If holiness isn't just something we do, but it's something we're made to be by the work of Christ, what does it look like? What's the practical application? There's so many examples that we could use from Scripture of elect exiles demonstrating holiness. We could look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or you may be more familiar with Rakshak and Benny, whose fidelity to God led them into the fiery furnace, but that same furnace proved that God was faithful to them. Or we could look at Daniel, who proved faithful both to his earthly king and his heavenly king, and that renewed the kingdom and elevated the name of God. Or we could look to Esther, who is both brave and humble in bringing salvation to her people. But I want to give you just one example. It's an old example, but as Christianity continues to lose its cultural power and cachet, I find it helpful to look back at how the church behaved before they had any. I spoke earlier about the book of Revelation, and I'm going to read a section of a letter that was written shortly after the book of Revelation. We don't know much about the author of the letter. They just call themselves disciple, and we don't know much about who the letter was written to, just the name, Diognetus. But this is a letter defending the Christian faith in the middle of great persecution, in a time when there were wild mistruths about what Christians did and believed. And this is how disciple describes Christians. As citizens, they share in all things with others and yet endure all things as foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, but are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored, and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. They are evil spoken of, and yet are justified. They are reviled and blessed. They are insulted and repay the insult with honor. They do good, yet are punished as evildoers. When punished, they rejoice as if quickened into life. They are assailed by the Jews as foreigners. They are persecuted by the Greeks. Yet those who hate them are unable to assign any reason for their hatred. Do you see what disciples is describing here? He's describing a people who are holy, a people who are consistent. They aren't simply following the rules, and they aren't resting on their goodness. They're going above and beyond. For instance, they have a common table, so they share, but they do not have a common bed. They aren't just stingy with their bodies. They're not just conservative, holy people who have very strict rules about how they can behave, but they are also holy liberal people who are generous with their resources. A few weeks ago, I talked about us being promiscuous with our giving. That's what disciples talking about. They are not promiscuous with their bodies, but they are promiscuous with their giving. These are the lives of regular, everyday Christians, and had a huge impact on their culture. Even in the midst of state-sponsored persecution, Christianity exploded in growth to be over 50% of the Roman Empire. How? Because people saw these Christians living these holy lives. They saw them enduring persecution. They saw them love. They saw them care for not only each other, but everyone else as well. They saw them hold to ethical standards, and they saw them live generously. And through that life, they brought renewal to their cities. And hopefully, you look on that description and you say, wow, but that's not an easy way to live. You're right, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to live that way, and we need to understand that. But let me tell you, if we truly believe the hope that we have talked about, if we truly believed who we call Father is our Father, and if we truly believe that we have been redeemed by the blood of the Son of God, then this way to live is still difficult. To live in obedience is still difficult, but to live in disobedience is impossible. Because you cannot believe, truly believe the things we talked about and not live like